He's currently the Secretary of Science for People and a local organizer with the Ann Arbor and Boston chapters of Science for People. And today he's going to tell us a bit about the theory and necessity of radical perspectives in science. So secondly, we'll hear from Lizzie, who is currently a university and high school chemistry teacher and has been involved in grad union organizing and other community organizing in Boston for several years. She's contributed a chapter to the book, and she's going to talk about her experience as an organizer and general theories of grassroots organizing in STEM communities. And then lastly, we'll hear from Shua, who is a physicist at MIT, was a union organizer at the University of Washington. And so they'll talk about the need for both broad economic and community-specific goals when labor organizing. And then briefly, we will hear from Science for Montreal's very own Mustafa, who will talk a little bit about organizing Quebec context in particular. So following on from hearing from all these people, we will have a lot of time for discussion and questions. So we really want you guys to feel free to share any experience you've had, any questions, any comments. And obviously we're gathered here today under a very broad umbrella of anti-capitalist science. So some of you might have a lot of organizing experience. Some of you might be just starting to think about what it means for science to be political. But everyone has something to contribute to this discussion. So yeah, we really look forward to hearing from you. And just briefly before we hear from Calvin, I wanted to take a few minutes to outline the current state of things. So most STEM workers are unorganized, but we have recently seen this strike wave in the US, which could reflect some new era of rising political consciousness among STEM workers. But on the other hand, some people have argued that the results of these strikes were just generally a return to the status quo and a co-option of the radical energy that emerged. So the question of raising political consciousness among scientists is not necessarily simple. On the one hand, in many ways, scientific labor has become increasingly proletarianized. So taking here as an example, the FRQ and NSERC PhD scholarships have stood at $21,000 a year. And in the case of NSERC, that's been stagnant for the past 20 years. And of course, many graduate workers inside and outside of STEM do earn a lot less than this value. So this means that many graduate workers are working below the Quebec minimum wage and living below what has been calculated to be the poverty line in Montreal. So this does present really obvious necessity for organizing among grad workers to push for a livable wage for all of us. But on the other hand, this isn't where our fight should end. As Jen has spoken about, scientists generally, oh, sorry, you did speak about this. Scientists do generally hold privileged position within the working class, not only because of the high earning potential of scientists, but as Jen did speak about, scientists often use their degrees to serve the interests of the state and benefit the structures of capitalism and imperialism, both in the technologies that science produces, but also in the fact that science serves to provide explanations about natural systems, and so is essential to the production and perpetuation of capitalist and imperialist ideologies. So as Calvin's chapter of the book argues, scientists are workers, but what kind of workers are they? How are they both exploited while benefiting from the structures of capitalism and imperialism? And most importantly, what can scientists do to help change the system? So to kick off our discussion, I will pass the stage to Calvin.
Uh-oh, see? Yeah. I knew it. I suck at this. Thank you all for coming. So I live in Michigan for, as you can see, for many years, and I know code, but not this code. This is very cold. And so I'm very impressed that I was here and so excited to talk a little bit about my experience and meeting new people here. So thanks, Jen, Claire, and Mustafa for this wonderful event. So since Jen and Claire basically puts everything like upfront, works taking an anti-capitalist stand here. So I want to know how many of you consider yourself a scientist? Raise your hand. And how many of you consider yourself a leftist? The record shows the majority are scientists and leftists. So so the idea of science being political is something that science people thinks about and engages with a lot. And so I like you, I'm a scientist and I consider myself a socialist. So in the book, basically the idea is to convince you, as Claire already said, that scientists are workers. And this idea sometimes it's hard to digest because you look at workers in general. You go out to see service worker who drives Uber, who works in a coffee shop. I don't pretend to actually live the same life as them. I acknowledge my privilege. I'm a cis male. I receive higher education. I have some money in the bank to travel from Boston to Montreal by my personal car. So I'm privileged in that sense. But just because I drink craft beer occasionally, sometimes more than I should, doesn't mean I'm bourgeois. So that's the idea that I want to say in my chapter is that we need to carefully consider the structure of the academic system of how knowledge is produced and how that integrates in the capitalist system before we can apply a class analysis. And you have the chance to read the book, you will see that scientists are workers in the sense functionally the same as workers. I think the best example would be I'll come back to this idea that we're functionally working the same way as within the system as a fast food worker who works in the kitchen. And I'll explain that. I'll come back to that. So let me be a little bit more explicit. I say this because if you're a labor organizer instead, you're dealing with people on my archetype. Like I have some privilege. I live a decent kind of life. A lot of people who have my socioeconomic background doesn't engage with people with the leftist space because of many reasons. Maybe they think they're upwardly mobile. They think maybe it's because they have the idea that they can become rich or whatever the reason is, and that leads to many labor organizations to retreat from engaging people instead because of this this sort of like a more fluid way of having them joining the professional managerial class or people who are like on the upper strata of our society. So because of this, people retreat from it instead. And perhaps in the 70s, when science people first started organizing, this lack of engagement in STEM is okay because STEM workforce was only a very minor proportion of the working force let's say in the global in the US and Canada that we're dealing with. But after neoliberalism, after globalization, labor exploitation has been exported to the global south. And what remains in the global north, is become service workers, like low wage service workers and higher education STEM workers. And there's a reason for that. Because actually I'm jumping my guns. I also want to say that if we continue to ignore STEM labor, it's not just because that the consequence is great, because not just because like scientists like ourselves will continue to see our wage decrease and our working condition deteriorate. Not just because of that, it's because what we produce for capitalism is being used for evil purposes. Let's say that. And as generally mentioned, what McGill did, collaboration with CIA, with experimentation with indigenous people and people of color. These are all things that people in STEM, scientists, are producing these technical abilities. And throughout history, of course, capitalism needs innovations to function. And this is part of the circuit of capital. And because as we all know, technology is being applied to exploit labor, and it comes on, and especially and this ability is is given by our laborers, the scientists. So if we're here to take an anti-capitalist stance against, we have to understand how to organize STEM labor, not just so that we can live a better life, but that we can reclaim our labor, to use it to benefit the people and not to use it against the people, right? So, but at the same time, it's absolutely true that people like me are very hard to organize, as I mentioned, for the reasons I mentioned. And this difficulty actually has a deeper root than just because we make a little bit more money than other kind of workers. It has a historical and ideological root. So first, as I mentioned, science and technology is so integrated in our society. We go out, we can live without technology, but that's how things develop. And you think of the acronym of STEM, science, technology, science. What is STEM? Science, technology, engineering, and math, right? This acronym is actually an invention of the ruling class themselves. It came about in the 1990s in the National Science Foundation of the United States. They come up with this acronym to basically carve out a certain area of study of expertise to make them exclusively like a source of knowledge, a source of knowledge production, and so they can exploit. And as a Marxist historian, David Noble said that the whole field of science and engineering was as a discipline was conceived to serve one purpose: to separate laborers from production. So which means once expert knowledge is specialized in people like us, in scientists who focus on one area of study, the ruling class who wants to explore this knowledge only needs to tell us what to do, and then we do it. But this kind of coercion doesn't have to be violent. It could be something like, give us a little crumb, pay us a little, let us think that we have this upward mobility, like a tiny stool at the table, have a science advisor for the president of the US that they would never listen to anyways, right? So these are all give us little crumbs, so then we think we're part of the system that would benefit with the ruling class. And again, and of course, like they use media and culture to prop up science is something that's noble, right? That's something we should spend our life pursuing. And I don't know if you had that in Canada, but in the US, you have to believe science. Especially that prop up in the Trump years, because everyone is trying to be like, oh, I believe in science because the right wing doesn't believe in science, so we believe in science. All the people who are liberal are saying that they love science. So this ideological distortion makes science sort of like a priest. We go out into the world, people listen to us because we're scientists. Not everyone, but most people who are mainstream, and they think that we know certain things that they don't know. And so this is ideological, again, because I know many people who works in science and works especially in also medicine as well, part of the STEM. They work 70, 80 hours a week during the training, or maybe past the training. They work that long, and they were paid not that well, right? But they won't do it because they think they're helping patients. They think they're discovering human knowledge. They think they're doing all these things that are noble and good, and then also they like doing it. So they're exploited by having them perpetuate this kind of self-depreciating kind of thing, and they just keep doing something that that they think that's great, but it actually benefits not themselves, but more for like the ruling class. And the second reason why STEM labor scientists are harder to organize is related, but not exactly the same, is that the training is very, very narrow. So I'm a neuroscientist. So I know a lot about this brain cell, this neuron, in this one specific part of the brain. And I know nothing else. I don't know trees, I don't know birds, I know nothing, right? I mean, you can say that, sure, because I need to know a lot about this neuron in order to do my job, to produce this knowledge, and to do my labor process. But I don't think this kind of division of labor is healthy for an individual intellectually, and also not for society. Because I'm no longer someone who knows nature, someone who enjoys knowing knowledge. I'm just a productive machine who produces data about this neuron forever and ever. And so if you talk to people in STEM, you think they're we're from MIT, sure us from MIT. You think that I think people like people who work in MIT, people who work in McGill are doing some cool shit, that they're so smart, but they're actually not. They don't know nothing about anything else besides what they're doing, right? I mean, so at this point, if you're like me, you begin to hate scientists for what they have become, right? But this is not the goal, of course, because again, going back to the point about the necessity of engaging STEM labor, trying to organize them. This is again they're hard to organize because they're more entrenched with the system. This like capitalism needs scientists, and that's why they're harder to win over. But that doesn't mean we can't. We're scientists, we're leftists. We're doing the two most difficult things pretty much in the world. So to explore knowledge and also to change the world basically. So this is a difficult task to organize scientists, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, and we have to. And so before I wrapped up, I want to go back to the comparison I said about scientists are like kitchen, like fast food workers working in the kitchen. So before chain restaurant became a thing, so the restaurant runs basically on the creativity of the chef. Like people go to the restaurant because the chef makes the food. But with supply chains, standardization, advertisements, you can actually run a restaurant right today without anyone hiring anyone to cook, and that's the reality today. And that's the same in science. You can work in the lab without knowing what the research is about, where the idea came from, where that's going. You don't know any of that, but you can produce for the system, and that's what science is becoming today. And so, last thing I want to say is that if workers in McDonald's are unionizing, why shouldn't scientists? And this effort is not just that we can become less precarious, but scientists who are paid, getting lower and lower pays, and especially those in the early career, they're exploited, a lot. But this is for and also this is for overcoming the alienation from the fruit of our labor, that we make something that we need to own ourselves, and then organizing against capitalist science is the only way to ensure science is not used to destroy humanity, the planet, the ecology. So this is something we must do. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So great to see your faces. So great to be here. I really like how I appreciate you coming out when it's so cold. We almost canceled school at where I teach yesterday because of the cold. We actually had some students write us some 5-paragraph essays about how we should cancel school. It didn't really work with our head of school, but I really appreciate it. So I want to thank Jen and Claire and Mustafa again for inviting us here and organizing this incredible event in this great space. We have a couple spaces like this in Boston, but it's really lovely to see any sort of fun leftist space in a big city. And thank you, Calvin, for actually getting me into Science for the People. I've been an editor for a while now, and Calvin was the first one to kind of move me in to the magazine part of it. And I've done a little bit of organizing with Boston Science for the People chapter, although I spent most of my time in Boston organizing my graduate union, which I'll talk about. But thanks to Calvin for articulating the importance of considering scientific workers as part of the movement against oppression against capitalism. And thanks to our audience. So like Calvin, I've had my share of struggles as an academic scientist. I got my PhD in quantum chemistry at BU. So, you know, my struggles range from falling into like awful rabbit holes of failure after failure to hiding just how many hours I was spending on walkthroughs for my graduate union for my PI. But unlike Calvin, maybe some of you here, I've actually since kind of shifted away from academia, and I've become a high school teacher at a private school in Boston. And while it's still a private school, I've remained on the periphery of academic organizing and actually learned a lot more about the history and strength of public school teacher K-12 organizing, which has been really incredible to see firsthand. I want to open with an anecdote that I actually didn't describe in the chapter because this chapter was written almost a year ago, but with an anecdote that describes a lot of the contradictions I experience whenever I think about academic organizing. And specifically, I want to mention that I come from Boston, and so my academic organizing experiences are very limited to the Boston area. And I have since actually met some of you and talked about some really different experiences in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm sure here in Quebec. But recently, a couple months ago, the graduate students at my alma mater, BU, did win a union election, which was incredible. It was a historic supermajority. They won by 97% yes to no ratio. And it turned years of organizing into a material reality for, for many, many graduate students. Around 3,200 are estimated in the unit. And it brought a deep sense of pride and joy for my former comrades and colleagues at BU, and for all of the work we started organizing in 2016 following the Supreme Court decision and the Columbia decision. And so just really, really incredible victory. I'm very deeply proud of them, and it was incredible to see from the sidelines because I wasn't involved anymore. Yet amid the rush of gracious emotions, I also felt a nagging call to think critically about the conditions of the election win. And this is something where how I approach the world as a Marxist really came flaring up. And I really paused myself on that day that they won the election and asked, what was this win really if the affiliation with the International Union, which was SEIU at the time, went against half of the organizing committee when we decided to affiliate. We actually had a majority of our organizing committee not want to affiliate with SEIU. And then what does it mean to win an election if only 45% of your unit turns out to vote, even if then 97% vote yes? And so these kinds of questions always kind of stick with me of winning is great, but what does it mean to win under the organizing conditions that we have? And so some might dismiss me as overly critical, but I've never been interested in just winning for winning's sake when it comes to unionization, but rather how and under what conditions we win, and that is what strategies we use to build power. So I'm going to get more into the practicalities of what it's like to actually organize STEM students in a grad union. And before I get into that, I just want to note that the unionization landscape, and again, specifically to the US, I'm unfortunately very ill-informed when it comes to the Canadian equivalents, but it's remarkably fraught, yet also really inspiring, and perhaps the two go hand in hand. So workers' collective bargaining and power has been eroding for a very long time, ever since the sort of launch of far-right and conservative attacks on labor, and even the involvement of the Democratic Party in kind of forgetting about workers' rights over the last 40 years. And it's true that corporations are spending billions of dollars that prevent union activity. Labor consciousness is on the rise. And I think as someone of the late millennial generation, it's been really exciting to watch our generation and Gen Z become more labor conscious and really bring it to the forefront of conversations. And in Boston, my home city now, there are new union efforts popping up constantly. in coffee shops, in bakeries, even in tech companies, all the biotech pharma companies that are in Boston. And we also have really strong teachers and nurses unions that regularly authorize powerful strikes that bring out the whole city in hundreds of thousands, like rooted in local communities. It's really incredible to watch. It's also, Boston is kind of a weird city, if any of you are from there. It's home to some world-class academic institutions, and they bring in hundreds of thousands of students at all sorts of levels, which also makes it a hotbed for student-led organizing, specifically both at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level, and even at postdocs. So it's been really exciting to live in a time when academic workers are recognizing that we deserve safe working conditions, as well as dignity and respect in our workplaces, even if those workplaces look a little different than a traditional shop floor. And what do I mean by that? I'll get to that. It's been especially energizing to be at the forefront of academic STEM organizing, which Calvin alluded to a lot of the challenges in organizing scientists, but I actually spent 5.5 years trying to do that very thing at the chemistry department at BU. And really what it boiled down to is that every free hour I can spend away from my research, I tried to talk to my colleagues about what made us feel safe in our labs, what grounded us, what infuriated us, what riled us up, and what we felt we could change by coming together to build power. It was not easy. Calvin already alluded to some of the, sometimes it really is hard to talk to a fellow scientist at them, to kind of see the world as a lot of us here do. But what I found in my 5 years of organizing is that most scientists actually are willing to have difficult conversations. You just have to meet them where they're at. And so if you walk into a lab space and start, running off with Marxist leftist rhetoric, most scientists will look at you like you have 5 heads and tell you to leave, or make some excuse like, oh, I don't have time for this, I have to finish getting data from my PI. But if you actually go in and meet them where they're at and really level with them and start to build a really deep connection to understand what it is they care about, because most people do have things they care about, you just have to, it takes a while to kind of find them and push them on that and help them realize they can use that to organize. What that means is that you won't always find the most pro-union activists in any STEM department. But I say this in my book chapter, it's a disservice to our colleagues not to acknowledge the leverage they have over our employers and not to build this power together. Conversely, it is empowering to talk to STEM workers about striking, as it can move them to understand the power they have over the university administration. And so having these face-to-face organizing conversations that can last months because you go back and talk to them again and again and again has been at the heart of organizing for me. So, if you talk to most labor organizers or labor scholars, they agree that this kind of direct worker-to-worker organizing is the key to building power in any unionization campaign or anti-capitalist organizing. So the same goes for any sort of neighborhood organizing. You really want to go door to door and actually talk to people about what their issues are. And use that as base. But what I witnessed in academic labor organizing, as informed by a lot of these big international organizations such as the UAW, SEIU, AFT, and if you have questions about what those stand for, I'm happy to rattle off the abbreviations. What I found is a tendency to circumvent grassroots organizing when organizing graduate unions, specifically when it comes to organizing STEM departments. So there are many reasons for this. Calvin actually alluded to some of them, but for one, the labor movement in the last 40-ish years has moved into what labor scholar Jane McAlevey, who wrote this incredible book called No Shortcuts, refers to as the new labor movement. And this is a movement that kind of mirrors the Democratic Party's emphasis on pollsters, on media campaigns, on litigation, which are all like really important techniques to any campaign, but are not the heart of a labor campaign. And they really can't replace worker-led organizing. And secondly, I think STEM graduate students are generally perceived to be less approachable, maybe harder to organize when it comes to unionization. And that is perhaps due to the explicit depoliticization of scientific education. So I don't know about you all, but in all of my schooling, I never got any class on like, what are the politics of the research that I'm doing? How is it actually influencing society? So What this really means is that we take shortcuts when we try to organize academic STEM departments. And the three main shortcuts that I have noticed in my time are an over-reliance on professional staffing, so using a lot of the resources of the UAW, of SEIU, of AFT, and these other organizations almost to a fault. So of course, it's really important to have resources, but to rely on them solely at the expense of direct worker-to-worker organizing, I think is a huge mistake. Secondly, what I've also noticed is there is a misidentification of leaders in STEM departments. So what typically will happen is, STEM departments already have low union activity when you first start a campaign, and the campaign I was on was really nascent. So we just really had to find everyone and talk to them. And usually what happens is you walk in and you find that one union activist, radical lefty in your whole department, and you're like, great, come on into the organizing committee. Love you, come here, open arms, welcome. It's amazing when you find that connection. The biggest mistake of current labor organizing tactics is that you identify that person as a leader. And a leader is not the same as an activist. Hopefully, I don't need to say that to all of you. I think we all know what the difference between an organizer and an activist is, but I'm happy to answer that Q&A after this. What that means is that, someone who proudly wears their union pin and will retweet everything you post about the union and, shout from the rooftops, I support the union, isn't necessarily going to compel those who are on the fence to move across that fence and support unionization. And so organic leaders are people who have followers. They're just, think of someone in your old labs or maybe in your workplaces, someone who people listen to. And that person does not have to be pro-union to be a leader. The really difficult work of organizing is getting those people to support unionization, and then everything else will follow. And so the biggest mistake I saw was focusing on activists rather than organic leaders. And then finally, the third mistake or shortcut that I feel like we have been making over the years is an aversion to strikes. So strikes are really, really fundamental to the labor movement. Very few campaigns have been won without at least a strike authorization vote. And yet a lot of the advice I was given by professional union organizers was to avoid using the word strike anytime you talk to a scientist, because you might scare them away. Oh no, it's spooky, you can't talk about strikes. And I once had a really fascinating conversation with a colleague where he works with inorganic compounds, and he's actually said that if we were to go on strike, I would have this reaction running, no one would be monitoring it, and actually things would blow up. It would not be good. And he said that not as a way to suggest that we should be blowing up buildings, but more to indicate that you actually do have a lot of leverage. And it's a shame when the university doesn't recognize that you have that leverage, and that it's really important to talk to scientists about walking out, about striking, about withholding labor, and to not do that, to avoid that, is actually a disservice to them. It's in a way disrespectful. You have to acknowledge the power that they have. And I will say again, most shortcuts were taken at the behest of international labor organizations that are informed more by traditional organizing models, which we can get to in the Q&A, which is not to suggest they don't know what they're doing. The UAW knows what they're doing for the most part, but their tactics might not necessarily work for STEM academic workers. And that's something I noticed, that when we were actually able to direct the campaign ourselves, we were unaffiliated for a year. We had a lot more radical growth. We led reading groups. We really got to the heart of what our issues were. And there wasn't this kind of emphasis on we just got to sign cards and get numbers. So anyway, I say this all to draw attention to the tactics that we need to employ to build power as academic scientists, because we have more power and leverage than we think we do, or at least than university administrators want us to think we do. But we have to be creative in working against anti-union forces, which means we have to take direct action. We have to be ready to uphold our labor collectively, not just one department, but all departments. And most important, and probably the hardest part of organizing, we just have to be ready to talk to each other and to really ask them those hard questions of what compels you to build power? What compels you to walk out of your lab? What will you put your life and your livelihood on the line for? And I believe firmly, having seen a lot of union victories and also failures, that it's only through this kind of grassroots rank and file organizing that's also affiliated with anti-capitalist organizing that we can actually bargain collectively for equity, safety, and dignity in our lab spaces. That's it.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Shua Sanchez. I did a PhD in physics at the University of Washington, and I wrote one of the essays in the book. So yeah, thank you, Jen and everybody else for putting this together and inviting me to join in. I actually got the invite 2 days ago and just made a very, very last minute decision to come up here for this. So yeah, thank you for having me. So I had a quick question for the group. Who here has ever been represented by a union? Cool. Okay, so there are some people. Who's ever been involved in running a contract campaign? Anybody? Yeah, couple. Okay. Who's ever been on strike? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think that was 4 total hands out of this group of I don't know, 30, something like that. So this book has it's approaching the problem of organizing STEM workers from a lot of different angles. And what I wanted to do with my essay was write a story for all of you about what it looks like to actually participate in a contract campaign. So the broad narrative of my piece is starting at the beginning of putting together goals of what we want to accomplish with the contract campaign, like what kinds of problems we want to fix, getting a list together, organizing workers, going into the bargaining room, actually more or less getting in fights with university negotiators, and then winning those fights at the end through the use of collective action, and ultimately through the use of going on strike. So I was an executive board member and elected leader in my union for about 5 years, including the time when we had a contract campaign in 2018. And at the end of that campaign, we ended up rejecting the university's last best and final offer, so they called it at the time. And we voted something like 96% to go on strike. And then we organized, and we had the single largest strike in the state of Washington in a 3-year period. We had over 2,000 people on the picket line, all at the same time. And from the very last contract offer that the university gave us to us going on strike to the final contract that we signed, we moved them by $1.3 million in the value of our contract. And we also won a lot of other rights and benefits. And it's written in the piece, but I'm just going to quote from it so that I don't forget anything. But some of those things that we won after going on strike were improvements in benefits like free mental health care coverage, increased childcare subsidies, new healthcare benefits for trans workers, new anti-harassment protections, and a contractual guarantee of no new student fees. Because what the university had done is anytime they gave us a pay raise, well, they found a reason to put new fees on us. So we found a way to block them in our contract language from being able to do that. And all of those things I just listed, they only happened because we went on strike. When I first started organizing, I had never been in a union before. I had a positive impression of unions, but I had never been part of the process before. And to be honest, I was kind of nervous about the idea of going on a strike. And through the process of organizing and talking to coworkers and building solidarity between workers, we were able to get a lot of people together to go out on the picket line and walk off the job together in order to win these kinds of things. And by the way, that also, I guess I missed the first line of that, which is we got a pay raise from that too, right? So part of what I wrote my essay about was to tell the story starting from the beginning, going to the end of running a contract campaign. But there's sort of a second idea that I wanted to highlight in the chapter, which you can check out. Through the process of just talking to literally hundreds of workers while I was organizing, sometimes people would bring up this idea that on that big long list of demands that we were fighting for, some of the demands would affect a smaller group of workers. So for instance, one that I talk about a lot is at the time, we were fighting to get trans-inclusive policies into our healthcare program. So there were certain procedures and other healthcare that people would have to pay out of pocket that was just prohibitively expensive. Altogether, out of our 5,000 people that are union covered, would have been, we thought, maybe 40 people that would benefit from it. And so it would not actually be that expensive for the university, but they just did not want to move on anything. You know, they never want to expand on rights in any kind of direction, right? So some people would say things like, well, maybe we should drop that demand because it doesn't affect that many people. So, you know, whatever, we should focus on trying to get a pay raise, which affects everybody. And it's true, getting a pay raise does, you know, benefit everybody. You could make an argument that, you know, folks from marginalized identities have been historically compensated less. And so therefore a pay raise is like a net benefit, you know, it's more equitable. You can have that kind of, you know, reasoning, that's valid, but also that kind of argument, what it overlooks is that the most active organizers in that campaign were our trans organizers, like the people that were putting in just so many hours, just all of themselves into that campaign were trans organizers because they had something really personal to them that they needed to win. If we had just said, well, there's only 40 of you, we're going to cut this. First of all, the university wouldn't care because, I mean, you know, you can have a list of 10 or 20 or 100 demands. Doesn't matter. They'll say no to all of them. But they will have a much harder time saying no to a big group of workers than a small group of workers. So basically, like the core premise of what I wrote is that by having demands that are important to people of different identities, it makes the contract campaign a lot more personal, and it can get people a lot more invested in working on the campaign. And it actually builds solidarity between people. So when we were at the strike, I actually spoke at the mic for a while in front of like over 1,000 people in a plaza. And like all these people, we were doing pro-trans chants at it, you know? Like there had been not an opportunity prior to that to do something like that. It was transformative of the unit of the people to be participating in a struggle for rights of people that, you know, weren't their identity. So the basic logic is that by having contract goals, fighting fights for people that maybe aren't your own identity group, it brings people together and it builds a stronger movement. So if that sounds interesting to you, or if you want to learn like the story of the contract campaign, you can check out my essay in the book. There's a lot of other great stuff in here too. And we're selling them. How much are we selling these for?
Pay as much as you want.
Pay as much as you want, 10 to 20. Yeah. And yep, that's what I had to say. So thanks. Ooh, sweet.
Hello. Hi. So that was the main content. That was the main meat. The one thing I want to talk about is that all of these were US-centric examples. This book is US-centric, it's written by US authors, but we are not in the United States. We are in Canada, we're in Quebec. So I am also new to Quebec, been here for 2 years. I can't really say that I've lived for a while, but I can talk a little bit about how it's actually quite similar and both similar and different to these US cases. So similar to the US, most union organizing in Quebec and in Canada is represented by big unions, usually Canadians, so things like PSAC, things like CSM, and in Quebec specifically, there's Quebec QSC, whatever, Quebec, whatever. And these unions, specifically in universities, tend to be a bit more segregated. So in McGill, for example, there's AXM and then there's ASM, which are separate for graduate students and postgraduate workers. Because particularly what's kind of what I've noticed is very relevant in these cases is they care a lot about contractions. They care a lot about contract years, getting their pay raises, and like figuring out every 2 or 3 years the cycle of negotiating with the universities. For example, I think AXM just went to court with McGill University as part of CSM, the union they're part of, to unionize part-time research associates, which, you know, they didn't win, but they're working on it. But all this to say is that also in Canada, you have this representation on big unions with its pros and with its cons, especially in these like kind of international universities, such as Concordia, and even in UQAM and Polytech and the more like kind of Quebec universities, you still have the QSU as the Quebec Student Union, which represents in the legal sense, right? Because you don't have the legal aid, but the idea of direct action such as strikes is not really prevalent as it is. Even though I think TRAC, which is the Concordia, TA, and RA union, went on strike, I think, in November. And actually, speaking of strike, there was, if you have heard of it, there was the Say Support Our Science March in November, hosted by NSER, or like not by it, against NSER. For pay raises of NSER grads, because NSER grads were not matching inflation, so a bunch of people went to the streets. It was kind of like a very weird ad hoc organization, the Support Our Science organization. I looked into like who was backing them, and there were little to no actual student organizations. It was all like the Royal Society of Chemistry, the Canadian Society of Mathematics, which is fine, but it really lacked the grassroots rank and file motion behind it. And I think that really caused it to kind of fall behind. Because Quebec has a history of rank and file protests. For example, 2012, there's the Maple Spring, the huge student protest against pay raises, against tuition raises, which were supposed to increase by 75% over the course of 5 years. And eventually, over the course of a very long and storied history of protests, the tuition rates for Quebec students have been frozen till now, up to inflation 3%. All this to say, there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to talk about in terms of organizing students. There's a lot to talk about in terms of organizing STEM students, difference between STEM students, STEM workers, kind of formalization of labor versus study. So much to talk about. And before I can tell that there's so many questions. I can see the burning curiosity in your eyes. But before I get to that, I'll just do a few quick announcements. So Science for the People is an organization, publishing magazine. We have a new magazine once every 4 months. The call for pitches is out for the next issue, which is on gender, if you would like to contribute. And the current issue, which is coming out soon, is on militarism. So if you'd like to check that out, we have some magazines there, but they're not for sale. But what is for sale is the book, Organize the Lab, Theory and Practice. You've heard all about this. If you want to learn more about what our speakers have talked about and more, all in this book. If you're interested in maybe discussing this more beyond this event, we have a Science for People Canada chapter, where, because Canada is big, we normally do an online meeting every 3 weeks. The next one is in 3 weeks. And we have a Montreal chapter that's forming. That's me, Jenna, Claire, the organizers of this event, who we're meeting in 2 weeks, I believe, Wednesday. Whatever. If you're interested, let me know. I can put you in the mailing list. I can keep you up to date. And also, we have posters for sale. That's the other thing. But yeah, thank you so much for showing up in this weather. I know it's insane, but it's also insane for us that so many people showed up. Thank you so much.
The PSAC campaign of unionization in 2005 of like the research assistant, like in Quebec City of Laval University. I can talk about that a little bit, like if people want to hear it. And I've also been like at a talk at CSM like not so long ago, where people talked about how can we use collective bargaining to include as a way to force universities and institutions to actually like do something about climate change and like, like the issues that we're facing collectively. I can talk about that, but I just don't want to bother people. So I'm just offering, if somebody asks me a question, I can talk about those things because like it might be interesting, but might not be. So you do you.
Comment. Hi, thank you. My question is about a bit of the pipeline from academia to whatever people go to after academia. So I think one of the challenges that everyone must recognize that has a deadline where you're only in as a grad student for so many years, and when you leave, you go into something else. So I think there's also a short-term view of the impact of organizing and unionizing and all of the efforts that we can do. So I guess the question has to do with beyond simply organizing and unionizing within the confines of academia, what's the point if there is going to still be an industry that is going to eat up STEM majors anyway, that has to serve sometimes the very purposes that fund the academic projects and the academic departments and those, fancy labs. And so if the idea is, sorry, we're close to the mic. Essentially, how do we go beyond the lab and really make sure that the institutions that we're trying to unionize as aren't, first of all, only accountable to the shareholders and the money that is used from an industry that is having.
Yeah, so I'm hearing, I'm at a topic that we should be talking about, right? I completely agree. And as to that gentleman on the other side. So thank you for that comment. So I want to add to that a little bit. So we are scientists. We have expertise in many very specific areas that we could use to tackle issues of our day, climate change being it. But at the same time, we were trained in a very narrow, as I mentioned in my talk, we were trained in a very narrow academic way. So our view of the world does not necessarily align with what the community might want. So the most important thing as scientists is not to, it's also important, but what is more important is not to build the technical expertise to solve climate change, but to engage with the community, to listen to the people, to know and to be among the people, to know what's needed, who are the most affected by climate change, how can we do to help them and help ourselves. So not just decarbonize, that's technical, that's important, but we need to do more than that.
Yeah, I would just add to that a story from a conversation I once had with a colleague of mine. It was like a year or two of organizing, and I asked him, we got to sort of the root of what he cared about and what he really wanted to change at the university. And he said, I would like to be able to direct my own projects and actually figure out, not have some say in the kind of work I'm doing. And at the time, he was working for a big hotshot PI in our department, on some laser technology. I can't pretend to understand anything he was doing, but he said he knew that the applications of his research that was based on the grant funding they got from the military was to basically create better security cameras for cops and prison guards. And he never felt like he had the leverage by himself to go to his PI and say, this is bullshit, I don't want to be doing my PhD research that in a way that helps cops and prison guards. And he actually felt that was a really strong talking point and point of just sort of discussing with our colleagues, what is it that our research actually goes towards? What can it help? What is it hurting? And that's a huge point of bringing that back to climate change, just how important it is to have us in the room making the decisions. That also gets into the entire structure of the academy in general, which could be here for 5 hours just talking about what's wrong with it. But I think his idea was really fascinating. Just his bargaining priority was, we need to be able to set the kinds of grants we get and the kinds of projects we're actually working on and advancing. Because why are we advancing the capitalist project through the PhD research we're doing?
Yeah, so I think something really interesting is starting to happen in academia, where someone might do their undergrad degree at UC Berkeley and be represented by a union while they're working as a tutor. And then they go to grad school at Harvard and they're represented by a union there. And then they do a postdoc at Columbia in New York and they have a union there. And then they go to Seattle and they become a research scientist and they have a union there. And so unions are really spreading, broadly in academia right now. And the dream, it's starting to happen that folks who were union organizers are becoming, folks that were union organizers are becoming faculty now. So I really have a lot of hope that the situation is going to be very different in 20 years, where unions have just spread throughout academia. And what that plays into with your question is, imagine all of these STEM workers, all throughout their education, they're part of unions and they're part of social justice causes. when they go into the private sector, they're bringing that, experience of union organizing with them, and the experience of being able to like challenge their employer and try to push for better policies and push for better directions in their workforce, right? So that's the hope that I have. And I think to some extent you're seeing that with tech industry workers, where a lot of them are educated on the West Coast through computer science programs, where they're represented by unions, and then they go work for Google or Microsoft, and they're bringing that knowledge with them. So that's one sector where I feel like this is really starting to hit. Yeah, and that also relates to climate change, because as we have more union workers in fields that are related to climate, which is, everything in one way or another, we also bring that with us.
I think if there's any, Mustafa, any questions on the Zoom, I will come.
So I have a question for our beautiful organizers. Like, I feel like when I look at STEM organizing, I feel like a lot of it really relates to the PI, right? Like you end up relying a lot on the PI's willingness to let you, or like not even willingness, but your relationship with your PI almost becomes like a political identity in a sense. Whether you have like a strike positive PI or a strike negative PI, it really changes your ability to do all of this stuff. It really feels like PI choice has become a political choice. Like you almost like you check if they give you funding, plus are they woke, plus will they let me strike? And I wonder, like, also this is talked about a little bit in the book, but like the difference between PI student relationship and like a worker manager relationship, because they are significantly different, I feel, but also not that different.
In your experience, could you talk a bit about levels of participation among unions and how knowledge is circulated within workers, especially context of, at least from my experience, I've always been represented by unions, but because it wasn't even an opt-in, it's automatic. Unless there was like a pressing situation, I wasn't really, to say that just because I was represented by a union doesn't mean I was politically conscious of everything that was that was going on with the union and the political space. So maybe about like, how does that come into play when it comes to a moment of a need to organize, even if there is a union, the scale, and how can a base level of consciousness be held, especially when